Glad to see y'all. Is that on? Is that on? It sounds like it or it doesn't sound? Higher. Higher. Oh. Well, you meant put it up higher instead of talk higher. All right. Has anybody not got the materials? Is anybody? Just her. And make sure, and by all means, fill out your materials and wear your mask as you see the need, and we'll do the best that we can to communicate all of our information. This sort of, it may be that after tonight you would see the possibility of taking the route that some of the others have. I think we got 5 people that are not going to chance being around me, and so they're going to be viewing and taking the class from home. And not all of them are real old. The only one that I know that's really, really, really old is Richard. But he's not that old. He's young for his age, whatever that means. That's supposed to be a compliment, I think, they use from time to time. But I'm old for my age, so maybe that's, I'm hoping one of these days I'll get into the elderly position but I can't even go the hoary head route, see, because I don't have gray hair. So I don't get any respect that way either. So I guess it's partly my fault or my genes' fault one. This particular book that we're going to be studying, as you will see in the material that I've handed out, I don't have an actual syllabus there. If you've been in any of my classes before, then you know there's not a whole lot that is required above and beyond just a regular auditor to the class. But I do expect you, of course, and hopefully you're in here and going to be taking it for credit and going to be filling in all the answers that goes with each one of the questions all the way through the book. There's a number of different ways that you can go about teaching the book of Proverbs. I've tried different ways. I've tried looking at the book of Proverbs in a topical type way and pulling all the passages that deal with specific topics together and like that. And that's a good way to do it too, but you end up missing out on other verses when you do like that, because some verses it's hard to figure out what category ought that to go into. And if it's a difficult proverb to begin with and hard to get a handle on, then it ends up being put in the let's not deal with it pile, and you sort of play the Passover on it. But here we're going to be actually going through every verse in the book and do the best that we can, and I'm certain that we'll have a better understanding of the book of Proverbs after we get done than we did before. And every time that I teach it, then I learn a whole lot more each time that I study it. A few years back, when the Jim Dearman came to Dunlap and brought the work Good News Today to Dunlap, then he twisted my arm and wanted me to have a segment on that program called Walking and Talking Through Proverbs. And but I thought he wanted, and he really did, he wanted it more from the standpoint of some of the Proverbs that were somewhat humorous. Well, we'll find out that some of those Proverbs that are somewhat humorous, they're not so humorous when you realize that the consequences that go along with the humor can be deadly, and that eternally so. And so that loses its but I mean, there's so many of them, though, that if you just think about it from a practical standpoint, it does seem odd as to how people think sometimes. And you know as well, probably already before we even do any studying in the book, that some of the Proverbs talk about the better position that one would be in as opposed to being in a position where it's not that favorable for peace and harmony. For example, it's better to be on a rooftop than it is in a house with an unruly woman. Now, believe it or not, I know you won't believe this, but I got hate mail from women when I would simply say, there's some places that it's better to be out in the middle of the desert somewhere by yourself in the company of rattlesnakes than it is in the house with some women. Now, that's a fact, you know. And I'm sure that if we were honest with ourselves, then we could think of some women like that too. But it's also the case that applies to men. There are some men that we would feel a whole lot more comfortable out in the middle of the desert somewhere than in the company of them because of their particular character. So the idea we're going to try to do in our study here of Proverbs is see the things that God upholds as being proper, good, and receives the acclaim of God and all right thinking people, and then those qualities and characteristics that are contrary to that don't take into consideration what God thinks, don't take into consideration what their fellow man thinks and does, then we don't want to be those people. It's a matter of simply following the good examples and doing everything within our power to keep from following the bad examples. And sometimes if we actually come upon an example that is neutral, neither bad nor good, then if there were such a thing as that, then it would be a matter of a judgment call as what we did in those connections. Look with me, if you will, at this little bit of introductory material. Well, before I go any further, as it relates to what's required, a course obviously is answering the questions. There's questions on every, just about every verse. There's a question on every verse throughout the whole book. So make sure and do that. Keep up with that. We're going to be, of course, trying to cover 4 chapters a week after tonight. So let's be planning ahead to be able to do that. And of course, that will necessitate reading. And I'd suggest reading the chapter through twice at least, and then going back and trying to answer the questions. And then, of course, your attendance is a requirement. It's impossible to get the workload done if you're not here. And that adds so much to the discussions that we'll have and all that you simply cannot get if you're not here. But if you are, of course, participating by means of the television, then you'll get the material as well that way, which might be a necessity. And at the end of the session, we'll have a take-home test that you'll have a couple of days to take and then send it back in. And that work, you can handle that in a very easy way. If you've put forth the effort to answer these questions, some of them that are just obvious, and the ones that are not so obvious, you'll learn those, and then we'll be able to say that we are more familiar with the book and are more capable of communicating the thoughts throughout the book at that point in time. So let's work towards that end. And if you need me to write that down and remind you, I'll do that before next week as well. When it comes to the book of Proverbs, we know, according to the information that's provided here from other sources, of course, that the book of Proverbs is attributed primarily to who? To Solomon. And Solomon, of course, is referred to as the wise man, and rightfully so. And the reason why he has that designation, him, of course, being in the position of being leader of the children of Israel at the death of his father David, and his desire for wisdom to lead the people, and because of his proper frame of reference there, and the motivation that he has as he expresses it to God, then God blesses him not only with that wisdom, but also with great riches too. But one thing that we'll see throughout, you'll almost be taken aback sometimes, because you'll say, how could Solomon hit something so square? How could he hit the nail on the head so well, but not apply this same principle to himself? Well, it's because even though he was blessed with this divine wisdom, he still had a free moral agency. He still could choose to do things that were not in harmony with God's will. And of course, we know that he did that a lot, sadly. But God used him to provide us with these Proverbs, and we're going to learn something more about what's involved in the Proverbs. But he's not the only writer of the Proverbs. If you'll notice, we have the scriptural designation here as to other individuals who also are involved in the providing of these inspired Proverbs. Agur in chapter 30, verse 1, King Lemuel, and we'll talk about him in chapter 1 of verse 31, and then various wise men, not designated as anything other than that, in the 22nd chapter, verse 17, 24th chapter, in verse 23. Now, we'll see this, of course, when we get to chapter 31 more in depth, but a lot of people want to have King Lemuel to be just another name for Solomon. And we'll talk about the possibilities of that, as well as the evidence that would lead us in another direction as well. We know, of course, that according to a number of passages of Scripture, that Solomon's great wisdom and all of the literature that he provided forms a part of what we commonly refer to as the poetical part of the divisions of the Old Testament. And of course we know when we're talking about poetry, and especially Hebrew parallelism, as we're going to be looking at here in just a minute, we're not talking about the type of poetry that, I learned when I was young, roses are red and violets are blue. You're crazy and I am too. That's not the type of poetry we're talking about. But there is a reason and a rhyme to it as far as the message that these Proverbs and that type of literature is in explaining. And we'll see, of course. Sadly, we wonder how much of this information that we have available to us, we wonder how much of that information was provided to the son of Solomon, which more than likely we're talking about Rehoboam. And if he did receive all of this instruction as a son from a father, then obviously it's another demonstration that people can do their own thing and don't have to follow the instruction they received, regardless of how good it is, because of the life that was lived by Rehoboam even. And of course, even though it is the case with anything, while there's a specific individual involved in who is the recipient of something, does not mean that it doesn't have a wider application to other people. Just because we're not members of the Lord's church at Corinth doesn't mean that the principles that are set forth by Paul in 1 Corinthians apply to us too in principle, for sure. In the same way, relative to this instruction from a wise man to his son, as we'll see in great detail too. Concerning the background, notice, the book of Proverbs seems to be comprised of at least two, and some would even say there are three different collections of Proverbs. The second collection supposedly beginning in chapter 25, and it's said to have been copied by the scribes of Hezekiah. Who's Hezekiah? He was a king. Was he a good king or a bad king? Well, he was a good king. He was one of those that we sometimes refer to as a royal reformer, because he was determined to set back to the original the things that were lacking among God's people in the southern kingdom of Judah. And of course, he's one of a few, very, very few, comparatively speaking, of those who had that mindset. And so as he's instrumental in providing a basis for putting all of these Proverbs together, possibly, and of course we come to that conclusion from 2 Kings chapter 18 at verse 37 that this was the case. We know that he lived 200 years after Solomon, and so these Proverbs, here's a maybe, of course this is something we can't know dogmatically, but these Proverbs may have been from a court collection used for teaching the princes, and Hezekiah had them published for the general use. Now, if that is the case, then that's simply him recognizing that here's something that was only being used for a certain group, maybe the children of highfalutin people in the kingdom, and he saw the benefit that would be derived from everybody having this wisdom literature. And I mean, we can see that too. Of course, they couldn't just go to the Xerox machine and start making copies, say, here, everybody get a copy and take it home and use this information to raise your children, because they didn't have access to Xerox machines back then. So this was truly an opportunity then, if Hezekiah truly saw this as an opportunity, in order for this inspired instruction then to get into the hands of common people, which will end up affecting not only the younger people, but the older people too, as they are given the task of communicating God's will in this regard. And of course, it covers so many different areas. Every area of man's life is covered at least in part throughout these Proverbs, and we'll see that as well. What are the characteristics of a proverb? Well, a proverb is a short, full of substance and meaning statement. That's what it is. There's, of course, different ways in which inspired men communicated God's will, but Proverbs is one way. One definition says that Proverbs are short statements drawn from long experiences. Okay? And of course, you know, it's always been the case. It didn't just happen with our generation, that when somebody truly has been there and done that, it seems that their experience may put them in a better position to be able to explain something to one who's never been there and never done that, don't know anything about it. And of course, as it relates to the failures of Solomon's daddy and Solomon as well in following this inspired advice, then they knew better. They just didn't do better in so many instances. Some 3,000 Proverbs were written by Solomon, and we only have just a segment of those in this book, and then of course in the book of Ecclesiastes, which is, of course, as well is proverbial. There's over 1,005 songs that Solomon wrote, but the only ones that we have available for us today are those that are found in the Song of Solomon. So there's other inspired literature that was available at that time, which is no longer in existence. But we have all that we need with what in fact has been providentially secured for us. The use of Proverbs have always been a favorite way of teaching. They're quoted or alluded to 32 times even in the New Testament. The study of Proverbs were an important part of a young man's education. It's a vivid, practical, short, easy to remember saying of truth. Henry Haley said, "The Oriental method of teaching with constant repetition of wise and practical thoughts is a form that would stick to the mind." And of course, we know that repetition, there's something to be said for repeating things. Obviously, when it comes to the repetition of principles related to anything, the more you hear it, the more likely you're going to be adapting what you hear into your life and what you're supposed to be accomplishing. And then I got some patterns of Hebrew poetry down here at the bottom of this first page. And this is just an example of what we're going to be dealing with in some of these matters. And it's sort of, sometimes it will seem as though there's a cadence to what's being said. And that's natural for sure. And so you read the first example here, you've got a thought that's expressed in the first part, and then the second line reinforces the truth that's expressed in that first part. For example, in Proverbs 22 at verse 1, a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and love and favor rather than silver and gold. It says basically the same thing, but it expands upon it to some extent. So there's some of the Proverbs that will follow that general pattern. And then there's another pattern in which the second line says the opposite of the first. Okay? He that is slow to wrath is of great understanding, but he that is hasty of spirit or impulsive exalteth folly. So here you have the direct opposite being said, and it makes the first and the second stand out more clearly in contrast with the other. And so that's a teaching benefit. The third example, you got the second line or lines after the second line that complete the thought of the first. In other words, it's dependent upon what's said after that to get the full impact of that particular proverb. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the good. Okay? I've said this, and of course I've said this at Dunlap one time, and right after I said it, lo and behold, the song leader, who was Gabe Dixon, he sung the song. When I was a kid, that all-seeing eye watching you, that was something, and if it was bad, it was sort of scary. But it wasn't intended to be just scary. It's meant to be comforting as well. And you had to make the decision as to whether it was going to be scary to realize that there's somebody watching you, what you're doing, as to whether it's good or bad, as to which way you were going to see it. If you was doing that which is good, then you knew there was a God there that was concerned about you and watching you, so that all-seeing eye, and that's this particular proverb hits on that. Another example in Proverbs 8, verse 13, the fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride, and arrogancy, and the evil way and the froward mouth do I hate. So here's a whole list of things that are in opposition to the way God would have us to work. And it's always been our responsibility to come to the understanding of that which God loves and upholds. And guess what? That's what we're supposed to love and uphold. And when we find something that God hates, then we better be hating it too. Wasn't it the sweet psalmist of Israel, David, that said, through thy precepts I get understanding, therefore I hate every false way. Some people ain't never got to that understanding yet, sadly. And the reason his hating every false way is because he came to that level of understanding that there's some things that we must absolutely abhor, despise, and if that is the case, then we certainly do not support it and lend our weight of influence behind it if it's something that God hates. Now, somebody, and of course, we live in a world that says, well, we really can't know anything like that for sure. Well, that's hogwash, pure and simple, because we can too. If David could do it, and I guarantee you, David never went to kindergarten or one time. And he understood that principle. And so our highfalutin intelligence of today can likewise know those things too. And the next paragraph just expands upon that idea. The book of Proverbs is a collection of inspired instruction on the kind of conduct which is desirable and acceptable before God. Do children today, and adults too, of course, do we need instruction as to what is acceptable before God? Well, sure we do. Sure we do. You don't just figure it out as you go along, and you don't count noses and say, well, here's all these people that seem to be pretty happy, they're comfortable with their lives and they're doing this, so maybe because they're happy and comfortable and everything seems fine with them, maybe I need to follow that direction. Well, you're going to be going in the opposite direction where you're supposed to be going most of the time by following that type of reasoning. That's not the way you determine. You're going to have to look at examples, genuine explanations from God as to what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. And of course, you would expect then to see this type of information in such a setting as that. You got morality, what's right and what's wrong, what ought people to do, what ought people not to do. How do we decide that? Do we take a vote on it? No. No, God tells us what's right and what's wrong, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. The other night I heard a fellow say, he said, can you imagine, just think back 10 years ago. Think back to 2010. Think back to where this country was 10 years ago. And now think about where it is today. And then he said, can you just imagine where we could be in 10 more years, in 2030? And I don't even want to think about it because I know where he wants to go in 10 years. Who would have ever thought 10 years ago that we'd have sanctioned homosexual marriages? Who would have ever thought that? Not 10 years ago. 10 years ago, the fellow who was president was opposed to it. When he went into office, he was firmly convinced that a husband and wife, a man and a woman, were supposed to be married. Of course, he changed that idea. So what's open to keep on pushing in the envelope to the future? There's just a few things left, And when you start looking at the few things that are left, then we're talking about the abuse of children. It's about the only thing left. Or the abuse of animals, one. That's all that's left in that area. So just think about what could happen in the next 10 years. Just think about what's happened in the past. And the only reason why any of this stuff could be allowed to slide is somebody doesn't think they're accountable to nobody, including a creator God. They don't. Sadly, one of these days they will learn better. We wish they'd learned better before then, for sure. And so you got matters of morality, matters of religion, the common view that people have relative to religion. As long as a person is satisfied and comfortable with their practice of religion, then that's really all that matters. As long as a person is conscientious and doing what they think is the right thing, then that's all really that matters. And really anybody that would interfere with them feeling fine about what they're doing, they're the ones that's the enemy. Well, think about that for a minute. Do you think that those 18 guys that flew those airplanes into the Twin Towers, do you think they were sincere? I can guarantee you they're sincere. Do you think these people that will strap on a vest that will blow them up and they know it's going to, do you think they're sincere? Well, if we go on the sincerity alone matter, then that'd have to be all right too. No, you can't just go on sincerity. Paul thought he ought to do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth, which things he also did. Paul was a living, breathing example of a person who is sincere and wrong all at the same time. And when it comes to matters of morality and religion and our interpersonal relationships in society and even our politics, yes, even politics, then the Bible addresses these matters, and we're going to see a whole lot of the application of those principles in the book of Proverbs. A system of morality which all men of good intentions, whether Hebrew or Gentile, could appreciate and apply to daily life. You expect something like that from God, wouldn't you? Well, sure you would. Because here, He who brought this universe into existence by the power of His Word and created man in His own image can certainly figure out a plan whereby man could gain the most and rise to the highest heights while here he lives on earth in preparation for eternity. And that has to come from understanding in the life of an Israelite. But there's no mention of that. There's no mention of the Sabbath day. There's no requirements or references to paying tithes. And there's no space and it clean. Proverbs does so the last little this book, and if you had to into this book so that's from that standpoint, hopping around would be a good age in it. Oh man, there is information that you wouldn't even think about unless you was taking a class in a setting like this on a book. Then that introductory type of information is usually about the only time that you do even consider those types of things as to the writer, the setting, the application of all that in a general way. So, as we enter into the book of Proverbs, we're going to read the first 9 verses to get started. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to perceive the instruction of wisdom, justice and judgment and equity, to give subtlety to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and will increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsels. To understand a proverb and the interpretation, the words of the wise and their dark sayings. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. My son, hear the instruction of thy father, and forsake not the law of thy mother. For they shall be an ornament of grace unto thy head, and chain about thy neck. All right. Now there's 6 sermons right there, but we're not going to be able to preach 6 sermons right there, or we won't get out of chapter 1 this whole time. All right? Now the questions are at the very beginning here. We're going to do a little bit of looking at other passages to fill in some of the things that are said here. For example, what are some background information we know about Solomon? We know he's the son of David for sure. And he's what, as far as position? He's the king of Israel, obviously. He is the last king of many years it's been since somebody was born. That's just not the way you do it. Some people think, even some of my own brethren, think that if you eat off the senior citizens menu at Shoney's, then that means you're spiritually mature. Well, it doesn't. It just means that you're getting a break when probably for the first time in your life you don't need one. You're getting a break on your food because you're at a certain age. But that don't say anything about spiritual maturity. See? It don't say anything about the wisdom as God designed it, obviously. As we get older, we're supposed to get wiser. But you know as well as I that doesn't always happen. Have you ever known any childish people who were older? And I'm not talking about those that were suffering from some type of mental problem either. I mean, have you ever known older people who were mean? And of course, they were simply mean when they were older because they was mean when they weren't older. They just kept on being mean and nasty and not fun to be around. So as God designed it, the way it ideally should be, you know as well as I, is not always the way it is. As a matter of fact, very few times is it the way that's supposed to be. But it's not because God hasn't given the instructions to make that possible, for sure. Number 4, what is the meaning of perceive? That's just another word for what? Understand, discern, the ability to differentiate, Somebody says, you mean we're supposed to be discerning things? We're supposed to be able to differentiate, to judge? Well, of course we are. And we do that all the time. You go to the grocery store and you look at least I do this. I mean, you may not do it, but you go to the grocery store and you see there's a jar of salad dressing, a jar of Miracle Whip. And then right next to it, there's a jar. It looks like it's twice as big as that one. And then they've got to where they'll help you out most of the time. You trust them, It'll tell you down at the bottom of there which one, how much it is an ounce that you're paying for those different ones. So you're making a determination there. Now, if I buy that big old bottle, that big old jar of Miracle Whip, well, I'll be able to use all that before it spoils. Or should I just go ahead and get the little one even though it's more? We do it all the time. We discern, discriminate, and make judgments. We have to, I mean, I'm on the other side of town, and I need to be at the doctor's office in 15 minutes, and I say, there ain't no way. Or maybe I can, but I'll have to break the speed limit. We have to make judgment calls all the time. And if we expect to be wise, then we're going to have to be doing a whole lot of discriminating, a whole lot of determination based upon the evidence as to what we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to do. Well, what's the meaning of the word equity? Fair. We're talking about what's fair, what's honest. And of course, God has always been concerned with fairness. I mean, I've made the statement before, and I believe I can substantiate it from Scripture, is that I do not believe that God likes crooked referees that calls balls and strikes for one team different than he does the other team. That's dishonest. God's not a dishonest God, and he don't expect us to be dishonest either. So we have to be fair, have to be honest. What's the meaning of this phrase here? Give subtlety to the simple. Subtlety is the idea of what? Being sharp enough to be able to distinguish, having capabilities. But who are these capabilities, this sharpness, this subtlety? Who are we supposed to give it to? The simple. Well, who's simple? Somebody says, you are the living, breathing example of a simple person, Freddie. You know? Well, simple, the idea is not somebody that only has a pair of black breeches and a white shirt, you know, and he always dresses simply like that. That's not the idea. The idea of simple in this context, of course, is a person that's innocent, and a lot of the innocence is connected to his naivety. You know, do you know anybody that's naive? Well, sure. You know, naive people sometimes make mistakes that they don't even know they're mistakes because they just don't know any better. Those are the people who, with the proper instruction, can get to the position of being wise, if they so desire. Then number 7, what's the meaning of discretion? If somebody's showing discretion, what are they doing? They're being what? They're being careful. They're being careful. They are demonstrating responsibility and being able to distinguish. Once again, there's absolutely nothing wrong with being cautious and careful about things. Now, of course, you can go overboard to the point that you're so scared of wrecking on the interstate that you go 20 miles an hour and cause all kind of wrecks all over the place for being so cautious. But as it relates to interpersonal relationships and relates to knowing God's will and doing it, we need to be cautious. We don't throw caution to the wind, as the statement goes sometimes. All right, number 8. What benefit is the book of Proverbs to the one who is already wise? Or is there any? We've sort of already touched on it a little bit. Suppose somebody is already to a level of wisdom. Is there anything beneficial to be derived from the Proverbs for that person? Well, you can always get wiser, more wise, more capable. As we said a few minutes ago, you don't ever get to a plateau and say, well, I'm here, and I'll just coast the rest of the way. That's not the way it works. You have to keep on keeping on. I never forget one of the last things that Guy Woods told me was, he said, Freddie, the older I get and the more I study, the more I know, I see I need to learn. You know? And here's a fellow that wrote, ain't no telling how many books and commentaries and everything else, but he still saw the opportunity to grow in wisdom and knowledge even at an advanced age like that. Now, he was older than Roger when he said that, you know. What is a dark saying, do you think? Because he's talking about that here. A riddle, something that you have to actually think about and ponder deeply to figure out, you know. Some things are so deep that they're sort of shielded from someone that might be in the category up here of an innocent, naive person, you know. But wisdom that excelleth, the wisdom that we can attain, will make those things more easily understood. When you think about something that you have to really think about, sometimes all you got to do is you got to think about this before you answer. Well, that's automatically, you know, you've lost them because they ain't about to expend any effort in actually thinking. But we have to think. We have to use our minds. Christianity is the religion of your mind. If you don't love God with your mind, you don't love God. If you don't use your intellectual abilities instead of depending on emotion to get you through, then you're making a terrible, terrible mistake. Number 10, what is the first proverb or wise saying in the book, in my estimation, at verse 7? That's it. All the people, and of course, there's a wonderful section of the book of James that contrasts between two different types of wisdom. The wisdom that is from above, and then worldly wisdom. Okay? Now, worldly wisdom will get you a degree, you know. It'll put more money in your pocket and everything. But as far as preparing you for eternity, it don't do a bit to help that. That's where you need the wisdom that's from above. And any type of wisdom that's available out there that is not connected to God and our responsibility to Him is ultimately worthless after this life's over. So here you have a choice between spending your time and energy and money and all of your motivation towards something that's going to be gone as soon as this life is over, or you can put all your fruit in the basket of wisdom that will not only help you here, but will, of course, help you in eternity. And so it don't seem to be, to me at least, that hard of a decision as to which one is preferable. The one that comes to a halt or the one that goes on and on forever. Pretty easy decision it should be for us to make. Number 11. What in verse 7 shows that mothers and fathers are joined in laying down the law to their children. Right? It's that Hebrew parallelism in which in the first part you got the father, the second part you got the mother. Okay, so they're both involved. And of course, ultimately we know the book stops with the father, but you all know, or at least we should know, that if the father is the one that means what he says, and the mother is the one that protects the children from the father being able to follow through on what he says, then you're going to have a problem with the kid. You're going to have a problem because they'll always be running and hiding behind mama and not having to pay for. And of course, sadly, we live in a period of time in which to even say things like the responsibilities of laying down the law. Oh, that's terrible. That sounds like you got tyrants in charge of that household. We have to let our kids make their own decisions. Really? I guarantee you. Most kids I know, their choice would be, I ain't going to school no more. You gonna let them make that decision? I just, as it relates to that, I'll stop right after this example. But I saw the other day, I remember years ago there was this program called the Babysitters Club. It was a show for girls mainly, Well, then they came up just a few years ago, or maybe just this year, with an updated version of the Babysitters Club. And so they showed a little clip from the new Babysitters Club, and what it surrounds is a boy who thinks he's a girl that's a part of this group of kids, okay? And he was being misgendered by the doctor at the hospital, and they made the mistake of trying to give a biological boy a blue robe to put on. They should have known that he was identifying as a she and should have had a pink robe on. Now, here's the thing about that situation. That kid that plays that part, that's the exact thing she is, or it is. It's a boy that wants to be a girl, 12 years old, okay? And what the mother said is that she started seeing this dysphoria, or whatever you want to call it, started seeing this when the child was 18 months old. 18 months old. And so when that child turned 5, she started helping the child transform itself through the means of, ultimately going to be chemical castration and all other kind of stuff at 5 years old. And an 18-month-old, let me tell you something. I've seen my grandkids were pretty smart, but at 18 months old, they didn't know anything. At 5 years old, they didn't know anything. And one of them now, he's 15, he still don't know anything. No. But a kid, the very idea, if that's not, now there is a parent that needs to be taken away from its kid and should have been done a long time ago. Man alive, I just can't believe that. Well, we don't have any more time. And I'm glad I did not get started saying anything like that until the end. So Joel can't hold me responsible for eating into any of his time. We got 10-minute break and then start back at 8. Thank y'all so much. If you didn't get the material, then just come up here to the front and we'll give it to you.